friends. Happy Friday. My name is Amy Willis. I am the director of the Library of Economics and Liberty website, and it's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our monthly From the Shelf conversation, curated by Arnold Kling, and today with our special guest, Robin Hanson. We'll be recording the conversation as we go along, and you'll all have an opportunity to engage with our panelists after a brief conversation. You can do that in one of two ways. You can use the Q&A function to send me a question in advance, and we'll let you into the room to ask your question. Or once we move to Q&A, simply use the raise hand function, and I'll keep the queue and call on you in order. So without any further logistical ado, Arnold, welcome, and I will turn the conversation over to you. Thanks.
Okay, so we're here to discuss a book by Joyce Benenson called Warriors and Worriers. And we have Robin Hanson with us. Robin is, his formal affiliation is with the economics department at George Mason University. He's difficult to introduce because he's sort of has great thoughts on many topics. So I thought the best way to introduce him would be to let him illustrate some of his interesting thoughts. One is something that he started talking about on a blog several years ago called the Farmers and Foragers, or Foragers and Farmers model. Do you want to, can you give us a quick, how did you get into that and what does it say?
Hello, everyone. I'm Robin Hanson. I am sort of an opportunist about finding frameworks of thinking. I'm just always looking at the frameworks people offer and trying to see what fits and what I can capture with it. And one thing that made sense was this historical pattern that we started out as foragers for maybe 1 million years, depending on where you draw the boundaries. And in that world, we lived in small groups that wandered. We didn't have much stuff to carry with us because we had to walk a lot. We were pretty egalitarian, relatively promiscuous. These were foragers. And then roughly 10,000 years ago or so, we had this opportunity to have a very different form of life. And it was only possible because humans were just very culturally plastic, and we could basically reform ourselves with new values to be farmers and herders. And farmers and herders stay in one place instead of wandering, and they accumulate property and things, and they have marriage and long-term relations, and they have classes and inequality and war and trade. And these are all quite alien and even repulsive to foragers, as we've seen in history. And yet humans were able to remake themselves this way. But in some sense, this was a less natural way to be. And so we use more self-control, including religion and conformity pressures, to become farmers and to repress our forager revulsion against these things we had become. And then in the last few centuries, we have gotten rich. And it seems like we've been drifting back more to forager styles and habits in many ways. And this is a unifying explanation for many trends over the last few centuries, which is the main thing I like about it. And so we say that basically getting rich takes away the pressures that turn foragers into farmers. You more look inside yourself and say what you want instead of asking what the culture insists about you. And so this is intended to explain changes in democracy, religion, fertility, promiscuity, art, leisure, travel, again, slavery, it's just a wide range of trends that roughly fit that we're returning to forager values, except at work. So at work, we seem to be hyper farmers. And in some sense, work is the goose that lays our golden egg. And so we are protecting the farmer sort of values at work, where we are submit to more dominance and ranking than even farmers would tend to accept, because that's what makes us rich. But then when we're not at work, we are more like foragers, and we like that. And this is sort of the Star Trek future, the culture novel future that many people have projected forward, that we just become more full of leisure, more full of peace, more full of promiscuity, self-indulgence, art, and less focus on self-control, discipline, fertility, nation, all those sorts of things that farmers value. So that's the overall forager to farmer to forager and a half story.
Okay, and let me have you illustrate your thinking with one more topic, which is the sort of the hidden motives of human beings, which you wrote about in a book called The Elephant in the Brain.
So I'm an economist, and in learning about economics, I learned a bunch of sort of standard accounts of how people behave and our standard models for that. And over time, I accumulated these puzzles. The things just didn't make so much sense with these standard accounts. And I came to realize that a simple way to explain a lot of these weird things humor doing is just to think that the reasons we give for doing many things are just wrong. And once you consider the hypothesis that we might just not be honest with ourselves about why we do many things, then you can explain a lot more things. So I originally started out with this with medicine. We say we go to the doctor in order to get healthy, and that that's, of course, it's expensive and we have to judge quality, and that's why all the standard features of medicine are there. And then we have data that says there's just no correlation between health and medicine in terms of amounts, and a bunch of other strange puzzles. And so I postulate that we, in fact, use medicine to show that we care about each other. Similarly, my colleague Brian Kaplan has a book, The Case Against Education, which I summarize in our book, saying the usual story about schools. We go there to learn useful skills and knowledge that we could use later in life, except we don't remember much. What we do remember isn't very useful. And a bunch of other puzzles about school. And we say school is, in fact, better understood as a place where we show off our smarts, conscientiousness, conformity. And that makes sense. And our book, The Elephant in the Brain, with Kevin Simbler, goes through 8 other areas of life, saying for each one how we give a certain standard story about why we do things, but in fact, it can be better understood in terms of some other motives that we have that we aren't admitting. And then obviously the big question is, why don't we know why we do things? What's the problem? And the story then is that foragers had these strong norms against bragging and subgroup coalitions and many other kinds of things that we're at risk of admitting that we're violating when we admit to the actual motives we have. And so the motives we present to each other are better protection against accusations of norm violations. So your conscious mind is not really the president or king of your mind. It's more the press secretary, whose job isn't to make decisions, it's to justify them to an audience. And so that's why in your mind, you're thinking about these better looking motives, because they let you say, oh, I would never think of doing it for that reason. Surely you must misunderstand me. I was only doing it for this reason.
Okay, so now let's get to the current topic, the book Worriers and Worriers. And I think one of the the people that I think this book will offend will be people who don't like to talk about innate temperamental differences between men and women. And let me stipulate that differences are only average differences. You have to look at individuals. On average, men are taller than women, but if you looked at me, you would see that I am shorter than the average woman. So, you shouldn't just say, well, Arnold, you're a man, therefore you're tall. That's not a valid inference, and that's probably not a valid inference in the case of these temperamental average temperament differences. But I think there are some people who would rather not believe that there are temperamental differences, either not believe that there are innate temperamental differences between men and women, or that if there are, they're not very significant, that what's really dominant is the culture, and that if you don't see women in proportionally represented in certain occupations in life, that represents the structure of our culture. Now, Robin, when you were talking about the transition from foragers to farmers, you said it illustrated the plasticity of human culture, that we can adopt new roles and stuff. Does that in any way contradict Joyce Benenson's Worriers and Worriers story?
So the book is very good at giving lots of detail about behavior of boys and girls and men and women in our world today, that is the rich world in the 21st century and recently. She doesn't actually talk that much about how robust it is across space and time, and in what way it's implemented. That is, she doesn't really say that much about whether it's genetic or cultural, and if so, how deeply cultural. And so we're left to speculate about that. And maybe that's good of her because she talked about what she knew best. But the patterns do seem very robust, and they do tempt me to think they are pretty deeply embedded. And then I'm not sure I care that much whether it's genetic or culture. The main thing is it's deeply embedded. So plausibly, there has been substantial genetic evolution, say, over the last 50,000 years. And she has this warrior thesis for men. And, anthropologists usually say that foragers aren't actually doing that much war. War was something that appeared more with the farming world, although it may have been most intense at the very beginning, say 10,000 to 20,000 years ago. So then the question is, how much has our warrior habit been embodied in our genes as opposed to culture? But again, it's pretty deep there. I mean, I very much, her data does seem, show that from young ages, boys are pretty into war. And how much of that is culture or genes, I mean, how much does it matter, really? It seems it's pretty deep, and we're living in a world where these are the people we have, and this is the people we should think about how to deal with.
Yeah, well, I think the case that she makes is, I mean, it includes primates in general. So there's this story.
Rarely, but she doesn't mention that very often. And then she makes sure to mention substantial differences between humans and other primates.
Yes, that's true. But I think it's Franz de Waal who tells the story of, the end of a broom gets left in an ape's cage, and a female ape, adopts it and caresses it and nurtures it. It's nothing that male apes will do. And I think it's either Benenson or someone else who points out that, when given choices of toys to play with, little girls will sometimes choose trucks, but also choose dolls, and boys will never choose dolls. They always prefer the trucks to the dolls, and that would seem fairly innate. I mean, lots of parents have tried to raise their children as equals or gender neutrally, and found out that the boys like the trucks and the girls like the dolls.
So the forager to farmer story should really start with primates. We might say, look, primates have a lot of features, including females taking care of kids and the males fighting. And then we have foragers who are deviating from the primate pattern through some degree of genes and culture. And then the farmers are deviating again, but in many ways going back to the primate pattern. So it's less clear which of the forager or the farmer style is genetically innate, in the sense that, the forager era had a longer period to embody it in our genes, but to some extent, foragers were always resisting their primate nature. That is, they sort of actively repressed status hierarchies and dominance and fighting in many ways. And so, yes, in some sense, the things we see in our farmer habits, yes, they may have been the results of cultural pressures changing us from foragers, but the foragers were repressing their primate natures. And yes, the farther back it looks, the more plausible it is that it's pretty deeply embedded.
Yeah, I was recently reading an article by Richard Wrangham, in which he says that there are kind of two types of aggression. There's reactive aggression, where it's your amygdala responding. I call it the road rage example. Somebody cuts you off in the road and you just get really angry. And there's proactive aggression, which is more like planning and carrying out a war. And I was thinking that there's this theory, and I think Wrangham is very much at the heart of this, that human males sort of came up with a biological way of selecting against the overly reactive aggressive males by sort of proactively going out and killing them, so that they didn't, so that the strongly reactive personality kind of faded out of the gene pool somewhat. But the by the same token, the proactive aggression could only be restrained culturally by coming up with institutions that would restrict people from cold-bloodedly plotting to kill one another. So so that would say that some of the innate warrior, well, I guess it depends what you would call a warrior personality, right? It is, the reactive aggression is one kind of warrior, but the proactive aggression is another. And maybe we've kind of tried to select away from the most reactive aggressive types, but came up with in some sense, the cleverest and subtlest of the proactive aggression types.
So the book talks about how women are often in conflict with each other, and they're reluctant to maybe do a direct physical fight, but they are going to undermine each other in many ways possible. But it's focused on pairwise conflicts, and in some sense, most other primate and animal aggressive conflicts are those sort of pairwise conflicts. And then she contrasts that with the male aggression and warrior habit, which is about collecting a group of men who all can work together well and who figure out who's good at what and try to include as many of them as possible and really prioritize thinking together about what would really work and maybe suppressing their dominance pride if that will help the group work. And in many ways different from ordinary animal aggression. Human male warriors are very cooperative and very task-oriented and very thoughtful about how to make their war group work well. That's her key story. And you can see how much of humanity's success could be pinned on these capabilities human developed to work together as groups well.
Yeah, I find that interesting. And again, I think Wrangham or others have said that, humans managed to evolve to cooperate, and it might have been originally in the context of large-scale war, but now we have other things that we cooperate in. I mean, most notably businesses and other large organizations, where this sort of male ability or supposed increased temperamental ability to, like you say, find the right person, specialize properly, allow for a hierarchy, but it's not a hierarchy based on oppression, but to say, well, this person would be a better, director of sales than I would, so let's let that person be the director of sales. You also have, I think, an interesting thing of sort of people being able to compete and then still get along afterward, which I think, again, the temperament of women is not to do. It's more like, she's out of it. She betrayed our group. I'm never going to speak to her again. We're never going to have her to a party again. With a male, it's like, oh, we fought hard against you in this baseball game, and now we're going to put together an all-star team, and we're going to put your best guys with our best guys. I just found her descriptions of young boys playing so resonant with me. I remember in elementary school running to the farthest end of the playground, whenever we were let out, and playing in a kickball, self-organized kickball game or softball game. And she describes that, whereas the girls will kind of stick closer to a teacher, stick closer to the door of the school. Those like little anecdotes, along with various experimental data, I found pretty compelling.
So it seems like we should talk about what would be the central issue of this book for many people, which is, if there are some rough differences between men and women, at least observed by boys and girls around us and farther back in time, how do we react to that in terms of our behavior? Should we react at all? And could we overreact? So I think many people will be concerned that we will invoke strong stereotypes about men and women and then sort men and women into various roles according to those stereotypes against their better wishes or against other evidence. And so it seems like we should just be really clear that if we have priors here about how men and women tend to differ, the world will, we'll like to use those priors as a first guess, but then go past our first guess to collect evidence on any one person or any one situation to figure out, well, maybe the woman will be best as the head of sales, even if somehow historically men have tended to do better at that. But we don't necessarily need to use these priors as the final answer. So then the question is, well, whenever do we really need to rely more heavily on the insights of a book like this for making judgments? What will we use it for?
Well, one example would be, should we punish firms that don't have, let's say 50% of the board of directors as women? Should we go as far as doing that? I mean, I could see punishing a firm for explicitly excluding women based on, like you say, this sort of relatively weak general evidence that, women tend to be one way, men tend to be another. You wouldn't just say immediately jumped from that to say, well, let's exclude women from certain roles. So you want to not be discriminatory. On the other hand, it seems to me going to the point of saying, well, if 50% of your software engineers are not women, or 50% of your board of directors are not women, we should punish the company. I think that's kind of going, that it seems to me that this book would suggest that that's wrong.
I think you're right. We might rephrase that as people having an opposite theory that they feel very strongly, that they're invoking very strongly. So, you could have a very strong sense of gender differences or a very strong sense of gender equality, either of which would be a very strong prior that you wouldn't update based on actual behavior of people in front of you. And we might think neither of those are appropriate. So I would, as you and I probably agree that the best remedy for discrimination, when there is discrimination, is competition. That is, if you let different people compete for different roles and you have organizations who are incentivized to pick the best because they are facing a competition, then that will tend to induce them to actually figure out who's best for each role, and suppress their priors, which might mislead them if they have other evidence.
Yeah, so that might be a solution for that. So Amy, how are we doing on time? Do we have people chomping at the bit to ask questions, or should we?
I have one question in the chat right now, and I am happy to open up for hands raised and so forth.
Okay.
Why don't we, let's see, Tom Gray, I'm going to put you in here. Hold on. And Tom, if you'll go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask your question and then we'll take it from there.
Okay, hi. Robin, I want to thank you also for coming to Bratislava a few years ago for your talk on the elephant in the brain. Even though I thought you were going to talk about uploading your consciousness to M, because that book had just come out. I was happy to hear you. My question for you is about whether your book, which I'm sorry I haven't read, The Elephant in the Brain, the motive for marriage is supposedly love and caring, or being cared for, and sexual pleasure. And I'm wondering if you think that there's a missing elephant in that motive on the marriage issue.
So our book, the first third, went over the general concept of why we might have hidden motives and the general evidence. And then we had 10 chapters going over specific areas, none of which was marriage or even romance. But we do think you could apply the same methods to 20 or 30 other areas in life. Plausibly, marriage would be one of those. So because we didn't do a chapter like that, I'm less sure what we'd find if we did a careful analysis. But the idea would be to take what we say is our best theory, say love or sex, and then collect a bunch of correlates about marriage that maybe don't fit so well with that account, and then ask what other account could best explain those correlates, those puzzling features that didn't fit. So I might first invite you to say, well, what are some puzzling correlates? In what ways does not love and marriage actually explain, love or sex or children, I guess, actually explain marriage patterns? I haven't really attended to that, but that would be the first step there. Collect the puzzles to explain.
Yeah, I'll have to, that's a good one to think about, sort of what could be the true motives as opposed to the motives that people toss out, and then what puzzles do we observe? I mean, one puzzle is a fairly high divorce rate, and then other puzzle is a large drop in marriage rates over the last few decades, large increase in number of single people. Does that mean that people don't love anymore? People don't want sex anymore? That seems sort of counterintuitive. So,
yeah, on that puzzle, men especially still want the sex, but insofar as love is also commitment, I think that there's a phrase that Brink Lindsay has maybe coined, hyper-individualism, which I quite like. And I think the hyper-individualist, as many libertarians are, is a little bit afraid of the lifelong commitment as part of marriage. And so there's a confusion today about love being just for pleasure on a day-by-day basis. As long as it's mutually pleasurable, it continues. But as soon as there's a problem, then divorce is the easy solution. And I think that that's a lack of commitment. So that would be the puzzle that I was thinking about.
okay. All right. Amy, do we have any other questions, or should we
I have
return to?
one, actually, if I may, and then we can turn it over to them, to the rest of the group. So I'm interested in the question that Robin raised about, well, what will we do with a book like this, right? I really enjoyed the book as well, and found a lot of it relatable. A lot of it, Arnold, in ways you and I have talked about, not relatable for me personally, but with regard to a question like what would we do with a board of directors, that question I would suggest we might answer in one way. And Robin, you hinted at one of the problems, right? Competition would be the best way to find the right persons to sit on a board of directors. One of the dangers, as you pointed out, though, is ensuring that people sort of suppress their priors if they have prior ideas about what would make someone better, right? So it might be the case. I would not be in favor of sort of a quota or something like that. But it might be the case that there are strengths from both Warriors and Worriers, which would be beneficial on a board of directors. What I think is a more vexing question for me is, you were talking about boys and girls, and I think that's the more vexing question, right? If in fact there are these sort of natural differences, with which I agree, right, between boys and girls, how are we sort of acclimating them to accept those differences, celebrate those differences, live with those differences, rather than try to do something else? And I'm not getting into sort of questions of gender at all, but just what would we do with that with regard to this book?
So the quote in the book that most stood out to me was just the sentence that said, "When there are no wars or babies, men and women behave much more similarly to each other." That is, her story is that there are these differences for war and protection of children, and that when those come to the fore, gender differences become the most different. But when those are suppressed, there is more gender equality. People act more differently and converge to more similar styles. And in some sense, over the last century, not only have we had fewer babies in wars, but we've been trying to push for that. I think culturally, push for fewer wars and fewer babies, in part in order exactly to achieve these gender equality ideals. And then you might ask, well, is that the world we want? Do we want a world with fewer wars and babies? Because in some sense, that's what we're doing with our children, right? We're saying, you feel naturally inclined toward these actions, but you need to move to the world that we've got for you, which is a world with fewer wars and babies. And in that world, you should be more alike. And we're trying to train our children basically toward this world we've set up with fewer wars and babies. But is the future actually going to be a world of fewer wars and babies, or is this a temporary illusion that we've constructed? That might be a more fundamental question here. Is clearly we're plastic enough to either accentuate our natural gender differences or to suppress them. But if they are useful for a purpose, then we might ask, well, what's the world they are entering into such that we should either suppress or accentuate them?
Yeah, the plasticity issue is interesting, right? But I mean, how do you mediate between, I mean, on the face of it, less wars seems like a pretty good idea, right? I mean, right? That's a whole nother conversation, right? But how do we mediate between that and, is it the case that, to me at least, gender equality and gender differences are not mutually exclusive, right? You can have gender equality and gender differences subsist side by side, I think. So I don't know. I don't know how we mediate that.
But I think most people have been interpreting as the way we produce gender equality is to suppress gender differences. That is, people are much more afraid that if we acknowledge gender differences, then we won't have gender equality. I think that's the wider perception. So it's, maybe it'd be hard to convince people, but maybe that's the route we should take to try to convince people that we can accept gender differences and nevertheless have gender equality.
Yeah, I think that I'm much more sympathetic to that point of view than either an extreme that says genders ought to be unequal, or an extreme that says quotas ought to be 50-50 in every situation. But it seems like it's a difficult equilibrium to argue for, even though I think it seems to make a lot of sense.
We have Tom back in. Tom,
Oh,
go ahead.
yeah. Well, on the gender differences, the reality of gender ideology is not just gender differences, but sexual differences and the trans issues of males claiming to be women and females claiming to be men. And where if gender is a social construct, then that makes sense. But there was a recent article about trans women are women, was a phrase by the Scottish female prime minister, until a male raped a couple of women and was sent to prison and claimed that he was trans woman and was going to go to a women's prison. And then they said, well, trans women are not women if they're actually male rapists. And so there is the reality of, the biological sexual differences. Humans, like most sexual animals, have sexual differences, XX chromosomes, XY chromosomes, and the expressions result in muscular differences. And that reality is a biological constraint which can be considered oppressive. And that's part of what Lorenzo is talking about, how any reality constraint is called oppressive. And then in Arnold's view of the oppressors and the oppressed people, if you don't like the oppression of reality, then those people who are trying to force reality on you become oppressors. And that's a problem with this gender issue.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, great. Heinz, you have a question, and go ahead. My video is frozen, but I'm glad my audio is still there.
I have a question about quotas. How do you feel about minimum quotas, say 25% women for a board versus a goal like 50%?
I guess I feel like I'm optimistic about a market enough that I would expect the market to take care of that. I mean, one of the, if to the extent that our society does seek or does succeed in starting to minimize some gender differences culturally, so that you don't have these differences that show up in the playground persist all the way into adulthood, that people get trained out of them. One of the results of that would be that a board that had relatively few women would nonetheless have all the strengths of a more diverse board. That is, the men wouldn't be as sort of exclusively warrior-like. Or as another example, if you had a very high proportion of teachers who were female, they would nonetheless not be not all be warriors, and they wouldn't bring a warrior mindset to a classroom necessarily. So anyway, going back to your question, I think a minimum quota would be like not quite a last resort, or a kind of a disappointing way of solving a problem that otherwise would be solved either naturally, like people would, a school would find it naturally more effective to have some male teachers in the mix, or a corporation would find it naturally better to have a board that includes quite a few women, or alternatively that the differences in behaviors between men and women would be sort of culturally reduced along the way, so that so that I guess what I'm saying is the problems that might be caused that a minimum quota system might be intended to solve, that the other solutions would emerge more naturally.
Okay, do you think that is what one sees in reality? Because certain things seem to take an awful lot of time.
It's possible. I mean, again, it is possible.
Okay.
Robin, did
If I
you
may,
have
yeah,
yeah.
if I may comment, I think there's an interesting interaction here between male versus female kinds or styles or degrees of reconciliation and this overall gender conflict. So as the book presents it, women's relationships don't last as long, at least with each other. They often sort of have a tiff and break up and then just stay broken up. Whereas men are often having a fight and a conflict and then reconciliating in order to come to peace. And part of reconciliating would be sacrificing and giving someone something in order to show an intention of peace. And so then we have this historical pattern of a perception of conflict between the genders, and then an attempt at reconciliation. And so I think part of sort of these board quotas, et cetera, is actually seen as a gift for reconciliation. It's basically saying, look, maybe there have been wrongs in the past. Let's get past those. And one of our generous offers to get past that is these sort of gifts of quotas or whatever, as a way to show seriousness and concern. And in some sense, that's a gesture that a man is more, according to the book, more likely to do and find significant, and that a woman might find less significant or meaningful. And here we've questions whether, and there's the ambiguity of interpretation, you see. If it's a gesture, then what you expect is the other side to see the gesture and appreciate it, and maybe make a reverse gesture, and then the gestures can go away soon after we've finished gesturing, and making peace. Well, that's different than a model where we're going to hold these quotas in place until we don't need them anymore and there's just equality of board members, because it just may not be that that's the most efficient competitive thing to do. In fact,
Yes.
gender differences are substantial and don't lead to equal board members.
I completely agree. My question is what is more effective?
That's what competition would tell us.
Okay.
If we had it over time, yes, but why not think what we have now is in fact efficient?
Okay. I have to think about that.
Thanks, Heinz. We don't have any questions. Would anyone like to get in and ask a question? I don't see any hands. Please just go ahead and raise them. Or Arnold
Okay.
or Rob, perhaps you have
Okay.
questions.
Yeah, okay, well, so I think before we were on the air, so to speak, Robin, you were saying that you didn't find, you found the book sort of interesting, but not actionable. Is that a way of describing it?
Well, I was struggling over how to make it actionable, and that's what we've been talking about in terms of quotas or other sorts of ways to respond. Fundamentally, we have this suspicion of malfeasance in some sort of coordinated attempt to prevent competition from allowing women's full abilities to be shown. So the accusation has been that men are so good at coordinating, they've coordinating keep women out of various spheres, and that we are now trying to undo that coordination to keep women out of spheres. And that one sign we're tracking about that success is whether there are more women in things, but the question is how far we should expect that to go. Even if we do completely eliminate whatever coordination there was, that doesn't mean there's going to be equal gender representation in all roles. And so we face the difficult question of how to tell if there ever was such a coordination and whether it's sufficiently repressed. And that's a hard thing, because I've observed that for many sort of roles, you'd say, many people are willing to tell you where they want more women in various roles. And if you say, okay, but where do you want fewer women? And they say, no, I don't want fewer women in anything. And you think, oh, well, that can't work, right? We're gonna have more women in some places, we're gonna have fewer women somewhere else. Where should that be?
Well, okay, so as of, let's say, 1960, I don't think any of the Ivy League schools admitted women. Doesn't that look like a coordinated effort against women? And why would they have done that?
Right, so the zero number is suspicious. If it was just 5% or 7%, then we might think that was just the rate then of the sort of qualified women who could be there. It's those extreme zeros that are going to make you go, that looks more like a coordination. So then you might say, well, there looks like there was some coordination, although.
And why do you think that was? I mean, what made, what made that sustainable at that time?
Well, you could tell a sort of, coordinated equilibria story where there isn't some attempt to suppress women, but just a set of shared expectations that each person feels the need to go along with. So, we have many contexts in the world where basically once everybody expects a certain thing, then that's what you kind of have to do. And so, for example, wearing a suit to an interview or something, you might think, well, sure, the suit might be optimal most of the time, but why does everybody always have to wear a suit to every interview? And you might go, well, that's because we expect the person wearing the suit to be more serious. And once we have that expectation, then everybody has to do that. And then once there's an expectation, say, about women in certain roles, that expectation could be strong enough that if you put a woman in a certain role, then that might send a negative signal about your organization or your intentions or et cetera, that you just wouldn't do that because of how bad it would look. So, I mean, that depends on a story of many observers who aren't paying that much attention, who can't get that much information, who are going to make quick and dirty judgments, and that you're basically trying to pander to those observers not paying close attention.
So you get kind of a conformity for the sake of conformity kind of outcome?
conformity pressures can be substantial enough to basically eliminate like small minorities from a population, where observers would look at that minority and find it, noteworthy and maybe not look as good.
Okay, so continuing this sort of devil's advocate line of questioning, then how do we know that as of 2023, the kind of irrational conformity outcome that prevailed in 1960 isn't still in some sense with us, or could appear again, or it has might have residual effects?
I think one of the simplest stories about how these coordinated equilibria happen is that people use a label in their speech about various roles and people. That is, in a world where Jews are being repressed, then sometimes somebody will say the word Jew. And that word will have connotations, and then people, you might say, shouldn't we have this guy for the role? He's pretty good. And you might say, oh, but he's a Jew. And then we go, oh yeah, I can see why that would be a problem. And so just using the word that labels a category in the context of making these decisions is often a pretty clear signal that that's an operative force, right? And so I think the norm that we have accumulated recently of just suppressing such explicit labels, at least, is a substantial, progress toward getting rid of such equilibrium when they exist, because I think we have basically, it's taboo now in the context of hiring or other sorts of role assignment choices to mention race, gender, and and other things. Now, I mean,
Well, of course, of course, it's not exactly taboo. I mean, if the expression white male now
right.
becomes a negative.
Right, so that's a problem with the anti-racist world, where they have a different stance. There's, it's not enough then to just eliminate discussion in order to eliminate the equilibrium. That's sort of the old classic liberal approach to eliminating discrimination. The new world says, no, we need to have a positive opposite force that we aggressively push. And then the question is, how can you tell when that's gone far enough or too far?
Right.
One question.
Yes.
I found your example about Ivy League schools very interesting. Follow-up question: what caused it to change, and how fast did the change happen?
The change happened extremely quickly. I
Okay.
mean, I think over the course of a decade. And my memory is that this was the, part of the women's liberation movement of the 1960s.
Okay.
And
Okay, I have one more example. Orchestras, or famous orchestras, used to have very few women in them, and a simple change in audition rules changed that. It was the audition took place behind a curtain, and that introduced a lot of change. Is that an example for a good rule from your perspective? In my view, it obviously is.
yeah, that would, if there's prejudice based on irrelevant characteristics, then being able to hide those irrelevant characteristics seems to be a good way to eliminate the prejudice.
A warning, I think a famous paper that seemed to show that is in fact substantially questioned in terms of the gender and auditions for orchestras, but that there still may be an effect there, but just beware that famous paper is actually not very reliable.
Oh, what happened with it, Robin?
I don't remember the details. I just remember that other people basically couldn't reproduce the results.
Oh,
I'll see what I can find in the background. Tom, in the meantime, hop in.
Now, on the auditions, I recently, in the last few months, read about how there's a request to get away from blind auditions because not enough minority people are being selected in the blind auditions. So there's also not just the sexual issue, but a racial issue on that. And along the lines, Robin, your question about where do the women come from is really crucial. If we're going to have more female board members, does that mean there's going to be fewer kindergarten teachers who are women? And you don't hear feminists arguing in favor of more male teachers in the K through 6 age frame. But in fact, I would guess that for many low-income schools where there's a high rate of single mothers, a huge reduction of problems would occur if there were actually more male teachers in the first through 6th grade as role models for young boys who are not living with a father. And I haven't seen that discussed really.
I think we should notice that the key issue here is that when this book was written, 2014, we hadn't had the big, huge changes we've had in what they call woke or anti-racism or anti-sexism movement. Whereas back in 2014, it was reasonable to think that the typical liberal position would be to try to eliminate the discrimination by eliminating the sort of triggers and the ways you could use the discrimination. Today, the standards are different. That is, today, there's a strong energy and movement for just having strong quotas and implementing them fiercely and strongly without regard to performance or other characteristics. And that looks like a movement that's got legs and growing in energy and will be with us for several more decades. And so in that world, it's not really about the sorts of evidence we're talking about. And in that world, even discussing these sorts of differences is somewhat taboo. Even acknowledging substantial differences between men and women will, for the next few decades, be substantially taboo. And even this recording may be cited as evidence of our being evil for even being willing to consider substantial gender differences of whatever depth they might be.
Although last I saw, Joyce Benenson is still on the faculty at Harvard. So
well, yes, but as
been
you know, there are exceptions to these rules, the standard exceptions, and she qualifies for a number of the exceptions, but you and I don't.
Tom, I would point out, as a feminist, I have been arguing vociferously for more men in K-5 education. So I don't know how you feel about that. When Robin asked the question earlier, well, where would you like to see fewer women? That's an area where I would like to see fewer women.
And have you written a good book yet? I think that you got to get the book out there so we can talk about them.
Well, if I had time, yeah, maybe. Arnold, I think we have time for one more. Shall we have Heinz go back in here?
If he has another question, go ahead. You have to unmute,
Yes,
Heinz.
yeah. Heinz? You're on mute, sir.
Can we?
Still muted.
I have
There we
no
go.
other questions,
There we go.
sorry.
There we go.
Oh,
Now
no.
we hear you.
Yeah, but he has no other question, he said.
Okay.
Okay. All right. If so I don't so overall, I would say that what I found interesting in the book was just the sheer amount of empirical study that she brought to this, and that's something that's a little hard to bring out in kind of forum like this, but just the number of observations in different cultures, in different settings for children, and bringing up the primate studies, it provides I thought pretty overwhelming evidence that there's something innate. Again, these are average differences, as with height. It's not every man is this way, every woman is this way. I think anyway, I found that very powerful. I think one criticism that we maybe haven't got into is just the whole notion of temperament to begin with. And maybe if you have a moment, is psychological temperament a valid thing? I mean, it seems like the academic profession only approves of the big five temperaments. It doesn't, things like cliches like men like to work with things, women like to work with people are cliches, but I don't know if that's part of the academic stuff. Do you have a sense of how reliable temperament research is?
I don't know.
Yeah.
Not my area of expertise. I would look to somebody else to know.
Okay, yeah, I would note some things. I'm not like a lot of times temperament is measured by questionnaires. I'm not convinced I would answer a questionnaire the same way a week apart. Questions could be asked differently and I would answer them differently. So I think there's certainly a lot of noise in those variables. And anytime there's noise, it makes variables hard to work with. But in reading this book, I just felt like these warrior and worrier temperaments seemed extremely plausible, and it seemed it would be.
Hmm.
I'm sort of disappointed that we don't see lots of empirical research on adults related to those.
I think her strongest point is to say that she's looking primarily at young children for whom she presumes that our cultural pressures have had less time and option to influence. And, certainly an experience as a parent, when you see these strong gender differences in young children, after you didn't seem to be pushing very hard one way or the other, that gives you the impression that it's coming from the kid, not from you or daycare or something else. I don't know how we could make that argument more rigorous, but that does seem to be sort of the main force of her argument for these being more deeply embedded, whether that's genetic or cultural. It's just that these show up so quickly, so early in life.
Yeah. I agree. That's what I found most powerful.
So I certainly can't comment on that question, but the book that I put in the chat, and Tom, thank you for that comment, is T, the Story of Testosterone, which just came out last year. I know, Arnold, you and I have mentioned that to you at one point. Another female Harvard professor, incidentally, who's written on sort of the hormonal differences and how different levels of hormones in utero and during various stages of life, early childhood, puberty, and so forth, affect the differences that we see. So it's not a temperament story per se, but I think it makes a really nice complement to this book.
Yeah, that's not, I guess it's always nice to see something that you can explicitly measure, physically, as opposed to something, how somebody fills out a survey, which is a little floofier.
Yeah, except for the in utero part is tricky, but yeah.
Yeah.
I think since this book came out in 2014, the one we're discussing now, it's worth asking to what extent it's had much of an impact on larger conversation. It seems like people have acknowledged, basically reviewers didn't say it's all wrong, but then they sort of ignore it and go on anyway.
Yeah.
It's my sense is that basically, instead of rebutting it or engaging or denouncing it, people have just said, well, female Harvard professor, will just let that slide and ignore it.
It's an instance of the woman in the meeting not being listened to or something.
Right.
Yeah. That would be an ironic tragedy, as it were.
So I thank you for calling it to my attention. I'm glad I read it, and now I will at least not ignore it.
Okay. All right.
That
I
does
think
take us to the end of our hour, Arnold. So if you have any sort of closing remarks, we'd be happy to have those. Otherwise, I think we can wrap up for the day.
okay, sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks,
for joining us,
Robin.
everyone.
Nice talking.